This is the Bossy Lady and Men panel. And I may need to interrupt people occasionally, and it's all in good fun. But we are here to talk about health citizenship and the concept of how we can remake our world in the model we would want if each of us as human beings had health citizenship, was a citizen and had the kind of agency that I think we imagine when we think of being a citizen. And I'd like to start with something a little unusual. There's a technique called TRIZ. Has anyone ever done TRIZ? Okay, so TRIZ is my friend Keith McCandless uses liberating structures to get people to think outside the box. And TRIZ is asking people to brainstorm, what would you do to create the opposite of what you want? And you'll see it has interesting results. So imagine for a minute that we were trying to block any possibility of health citizenship. What would be the things that we would do in order to do that? And we're just going to do popcorn. We're not going to do mic runner or anything like that. Just shout out your answer.
Regulations.
So, what kind of regulations?
To just stop collaboration.
Oh, regulations to stop collaboration. Excellent.
More jargon.
What's that?
Jargon.
More jargon.
More jargon. Like what kind of jargon?
Like medical.
Super lots of medical jargon in the regulations would be even
Acronyms.
better, right? What else? What else? What else?
Make it illegal for you to self-diagnose.
Illegal to self-diagnose. Is that the case
Nice.
today?
Make it illegal for you to
Essentially.
actually be able to look up information about yourself.
Illegal to look up information or self-diagnose. Yeah, so that would be against the law.
Yeah, only doctors can.
Only doctors. Is that
That's how it should be.
only doctors? Doctors. So Roni, luckily we have a doctor on the panel so he can diagnose us. Anything else? What else would we do if we wanted to block citizenship?
Shut down online health platforms.
Super great. Yeah, all this stuff where you self-diagnose and share your data, make it illegal. Regulations against that. What else? Well, I think you can already see the germs of what we don't want to have happen are happening in our very behavior. And even when we write regulations with the intent to enable empowerment, we often unintentionally block it. Even when we say we want to create patient engagement, even that term itself suggests that there is something to engage with that's not the patients themselves. That is a set of experts that will attract those patients when they're ready with the solution. So one of the things I'd like us to do in this panel is not just talk about the innovations that we're seeing, and that term that, you know, the future is here, is just poorly distributed is very much the case for this, but also name the assumptions we want to throw away so that when we're talking about health citizenship, we can see that some of these actions we're taking with the best possible intention can sometimes unintentionally create the opposite of the future we want. So I'd like us to just play that game together, because I think, I believe that to create health citizenship, it's going to be a lot less about patients or people changing, and it will be a lot more about experts changing the way we approach problems. In fact, I remember a great Twitter exchange between our friend Erin Moore and The World, where she said, could I just tell you I hate the term patient engagement? No, her son has CF, and she spends a great deal of time making sure he has the best possible care. No one is more engaged and involved than the patient. I want researcher, clinician, and industry engagement. So I just want to frame that up for a minute. If it's engagement, it's probably us engaging and meeting. It's probably not expecting that person to change. And what are the assumptions we want to throw away? So just want to lay that out as a starting point. So I'd like to start with Roni, because I feel like this set of questions around assumptions to throw away and how do we create the space for that kind of true collaboration between patients, providers, and scientists is at the heart of your work and of the platform that you're building. What does this look like? And is there something you would invite folks to come along that journey with you? But what does that look like in Smart Patients and in the work you do?
So, kind of in the spirit of how you started, I sometimes think of myself as a recovering paternalistic physician. I'm still a physician, and I'm still paternalistic, and I'm working on it. And
Are there meetings?
Right after.
Steps.
Hi, I'm Roni. And when I listen to and learn from the conversations among patients and family caregivers in the communities that I have the privilege of helping run on Smart Patients, every day I am surprised because I still don't get it. Like I'm still surprised at the breadth and depth of conversations. And what it makes me think about is all of the things that we do, from designing the waiting room to designing the clinical trial to deciding how and when to have certain conversations. We come to all of those things with a tremendous amount of assumptions, and not just assumptions about the right way to do it, but assumptions about our audience or our co-conversationalist. And a lot of our assumptions are wrong because we're imperfect, and the things that we've built are imperfect. And so while we can't redesign everything all the time, because then nothing would ever be sort of in production, I think that on a daily basis, we should be looking at some of the key work that we're doing and saying, what assumption should I notice about this, throw away, and have a conversation with my end users, however you want to frame that, to redesign. So an example that came up recently was conversations about end of life for a general oncologist. When and how should they happen? And there's a little bit of science on this, but there's a whole lot of art and a lot of experience and judgment. And of course, there's not a correct answer. Some people will say, I don't want to talk about this until we absolutely have to. And some people will say, I'm so relieved that you brought this up because I've been really worried about X. And how do we start thinking about that without it being stressful? And I saw that there's the palliative care thing, but that's the same thing as hospice, right? No, it's not. And let's have that conversation. And so I think there's just a lot of things that we don't give ourselves permission to question and talk about as professionals, that it's actually a relief when someone or we give ourselves permission to talk about what are we really trying to accomplish here with you, my patient, or I spend plenty of time as a patient, and so I think challenging assumptions, at least challenge one assumption every day, and then usually that'll be a nice easy segue to okay, well, how can we reframe that in a way that's driven by the people that we're trying to serve that we usually forget to listen to until the very end.
I think I with little devotion, am part of a Sangha practice, Sangha circle, and one of the, certainly in meditation, letting go of control. And I remember something Paul Wallace, somebody who I love, once said. He said he was an oncologist, and he said the first time he had a patient come with a bag of articles that she had read, every single one of them, and he got really defensive, and then he sat back in his chair and he said, "What role do you want me to play?" And she said, "Oh, well, you have medical training. I've read all these articles, but I could use some help guiding myself through understanding them." And just sort of that, like being able to take that breath and step back. And
it wasn't a quiz.
It was not a quiz, right? I'm wondering, Jen, and you have anyone with the term novel in their title has got to be onto something, right? But you help create partnerships, novel partnerships between patients and researchers and others. I'd love to hear about what that is for the group. But maybe to start back to Roni's point, what is one assumption you've had to throw away as you've engaged in these partnerships?
So I think the biggest assumption for me, and perhaps for other colleagues in the industry, is thinking about patients with a capital P and thinking of them as one homogenous group, and starting to distinguish and tailor our levels of engagement, our ways of engaging as a company with different members of that patient community. So I would say in recent years, companies are starting to think about how they engage with individual patients, as well as with patient thought leaders or people who have an elevated level of scientific knowledge or exchange, who've built a peer network and have a following, and then how they're engaging with more formal nonprofit organizations. And depending on the company, there might be stronger history or strengths in engaging with one of those different members of the patient community. And for us, as our portfolio has taken us into new therapeutic areas where caregivers in particular have had an increased importance in supporting the patient and playing a really critical role in that healthcare ecosystem, we've had to think differently about how we're serving those communities.
So it's always tough. I've worked with a lot of innovators in government. We're part of the myself, I'm part of the diaspora. Kathy and Lucia also are part of the diaspora. This is what we call ourselves. But the dilemma of the innovator is how do you do innovative things and then make it practice, right? So how, eventually you want to shed the word novel and just have it be partnerships, right? Yeah. How do you think about that within a company? How do you think about making it practice rather than making it novel?
Yeah, Ken Getz talks about this and his colleagues at DIA, and they're trying to uncover that formula for what makes patient engagement stick and what makes it mainstay practice as opposed to something interesting and different and temporal. And what their research has shown is that you need a couple of components. The ones that we've seen to be most critical are senior leader engagement and very clear goals and expectations for teams about how they prioritize patient input in the midst of competing goals around agility and speed and getting trials completed and ultimately drugs to patients more quickly. We've also seen that there needs to be an infrastructure. So teams and companies obviously vary, but the ones that are centralized and have a centralized function operate very differently than when you have a decentralized approach. And in that decentralized approach, you need leadership commitment and infrastructure and outside spend and internal headcount resources in individual teams in order for it to actually stick.
Kathy.
Claudia.
So Kathy and I might have met for the first time at a brainstorming session, talking about patients involved in research. That was the very beginning stage of the All of Us research effort. I'm not sure if that was the first time we met, but it might have been. And now you are leading a new organization whose central concept is patients as drivers of research, right? Or maybe you can tell us, but that is one of the central concepts. So you are sort of at the heart of that future that we're trying to build. But you also have a beautifully skeptical mind. So as you're thinking about leading this organization and taking this work forward, what are your big questions? And what do you see as the most shiny glimmers of hope or change on the horizon as you look at your organization?
So the hopey changey thing?
Exactly. You notice there are no Post-its here, right? I could have.
That's true. So I am the new CEO of an organization that is sort of a startup and sort of a turnaround acquisition. So
Welcome
it is
to my world.
Yeah, so it is a startup in that I don't yet have any employee benefits and I don't have an office.
All the good things.
And I just realized that it was against the law not to have workers' comp. So in all of those ways, it is totally a startup, but I inherited this massive national network that has been around for about 5 years, that has had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars invested in it. And they have as the buzzword that it is people-centered or patient-centered. But when you scratch the surface, as with many things, it's there's not a ton of, and you talked about Ken's work, there's not a ton of evidence actually to tell us how do we partner with patients or partner with research participants in a way that has an outcome that we can measure, right? So I went to a DIA conference on the metrics of patient engagement, and after 2 days I had heard not a word about the metrics of patient engagement, right? So I feel like I have this big national network where we can do a randomized clinical trial on interventions for different therapeutic areas with different kinds of people, and we can actually randomize on top of that different kinds of participant engagement. So I want to generate
You have to get IRB approval for that?
Sure. I want to generate real data for what constitutes successful patient and participant engagement. And if we can decrease the number of clinical trials that fail and fail to generate any data because of failures in accrual, that will be a big economic success, but it will also mean that when we're interacting with patients, we're doing so authentically, right? So we're being honest with them, that they're making a contribution. So that's what I'm excited about.
Wow.
Yeah.
When should we? That's really amazing. It's really fun, actually, as someone who we worked in the trenches together just several months ago, and to see all the amazing things people are out there doing and continuing. Thank you, Eric.
We left Eric behind.
That's why he's in the front row. I'm wondering. Actually, I'm going to flip back because I forgot to do something, which is introduce the panel. And this is like the part you all dread, right? You read through the bios. I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to ask each person to say their name, their organization, and their superpower. So that if that superpower talks to you, you can come talk to them later. So let's start with Beth.
So I'm Beth Meagher, partner at Deloitte. And I would say my superpower, like on a day-to-day basis, is hydration, but I'm thinking you might not want to talk about that.
If you need to get up, please.
Later, right? If you do, we should talk. Yeah, indeed. But it is the ability to bring people together.
Nice. Both are helpful.
Totally disparate. The hydration for all of us.
Okay.
I'm Kathy Hudson, and I'm with the People-Centered Research Foundation, and I'm looking for a new name. So please give me a single word name that I can use for my organization. And I think my superpower is laughter.
Wow. Good. And beer.
And beer.
Yes. There's a hydration.
Which is related to hydration. Yeah.
Call me the next day.
Exactly. Come back later, everyone.
Jen Mills with Genentech. I report into the Alliance and Advocacy Relations team, which is part of government affairs. My superpower is the ability to sort of see things, and not in a creepy way, but in a way of being able to see internal opportunities and external trends and bring people together to gain momentum.
Nice. Claudia Williams, Manifest MedEx. My superpower is, well, I've been told it's both a power, it's a feature and a bug, right? It's asking hard questions and asking a lot of questions.
I'm Roni Zeiger, founder and CEO of Smart Patients, and I think my superpower is building tools to give communities voice and power.
I'm Lucia Savage. I'm the Chief Privacy and Regulatory Officer at Omada Health, and I think my superpower is explaining complicated things in easy terms.
Nice.
That's a good one.
Check out her blog.
Absolutely. Kathy can vouch for
Well, she's going to host us all in Oakland when she arrives there.
That's right.
Beth, I'm going to flip so Beth, I want to just follow up on what Kathy said and what Jen said, who talked about, I think, new ways of doing the work. And as thinking about what you've done around the X Prize and other things, it's new ways of doing the work. And I often think the patient stories, at least, or enrollee, whatever stories, that are most exciting to me are just stories of people doing awesome, cool things.
Yep.
The motivation of being a patient often is the thing that leads you to that doorstep of like, I just got to break this and start over again, because a lot's at stake often. But I think in frameworks like the X Prize, you're trying to create a platform for those breaking it and trying again. Do you want to talk a little bit about what that looks like from your from your vantage, and what you've learned about how to create health citizenship through those?
Yeah, so I think there is an absolute movement for patients and citizens to not only be participants, which I think we've talked a lot about today in terms of data and access and participation, but I also see patients as solvers. And so I think patients deeply want to be part of the solution. And so I think crowdsourcing and X Prize and game designs are great ways to really make it accessible to, frankly, democratize and get some great ideas. And so As an example right now, we're working with Health and Human Services to do an opioid abuse hackathon. So looking at prevention, diagnosis, and treatment, and bringing together data scientists to basically look at the data, hack it, and then come up with some of the solutions. And so I think there's a real interest for patients and citizens to become part of the solution.
How many of you have seen Todd Parks speak? Okay, how many of you have heard him say Joy's Law? Okay, so Joy's Law is essentially this idea that all the smartest people work for somebody else, or most of them, because you have a few of them, but most of them. And so this concept of opening up opportunities for collaboration that haven't existed. And frankly, I think when we thinking about like Roni's work, it's just recognizing the expertise that already is there, but if you could connect it or allow folks to exchange more freely or in a way that is informed by AI or other things, how much more powerful could that be? One of the examples I often talk about, many of us know Matt Might. Here's a guy whose son was diagnosed with a super rare condition, so rare that the doctors basically said, sorry, we don't have any other patients. And he's like, I'm a computer scientist, I'm gonna find the other patients. And he found them. And then having found them, he formed a community. Having formed a community, he invited the researchers in. Having invited the researchers in, the pharma company said, yeah, we'll fund something in this area. So like, who else could have done that but somebody who had such good SEO ability that he could write a blog post that the patients would find? So that's pretty remarkable. I think one of the things that has been apparent to me, I've worked a lot on data blocking and data liberation and patience. And the thing about data and information is it's actually not a scarce resource in that economic sense that by sharing it, it doesn't diminish in value. So food and bread, yes, you eat it, it's gone. Data, you share it, it's still there. And so if you think about it in purely kind of economic terms, we should be in a world recognizing the abundance of data and allowing us to build on it, competing over the things that are truly scarce, maybe people's eyeballs or our ability to use technology. But if data is an abundant resource, how do we build a framework of use of it that recognizes that? And I think there's a flip of that, which is this idea that our way of protecting patients, our way of creating ethical constructs around data is largely to stop bad things from happening. But often when you talk to patients or moms like Erin Moore or others whose kids could benefit from research, they find it offensive that their data was not used more widely. They find it offensive that a researcher wouldn't share that data, yes, with permission and transparency, but to them, it's like all that time and energy. When Kathy Juicy said this morning, like, I had to pay again to have people use the data. I had to pay again to get it from the EHRs. That is not an ethical construct for a participant, a researcher, a mom, or a patient, right? So as we think about moving to a new social compact as a new ethical construct, what could that look like? And I'm going to ask Lucia. So Lucia is in the world of protection, but also is one of the most sharp thinkers about a world of what could that social contract look like. So how do you balance those? I don't know if they're competing at all, but on the one hand, the need to protect people. On the other hand, the need to engage in a very different way to think about what's ethical.
So if you look back over the history of the way we confine the use of medical information, it invariably is exactly what Claudia said. It's invariably a law was passed or a policy was enacted to protect the people in that data from having bad things happen to them. So if you want to let the data out, you might still have to solve that problem, but maybe you should solve it in a different way. So we can protect people by not letting data be shared, and I'd be the first to tell you that every employee does not want their employer to know their health information. That is the thing that they really don't want because they don't want to be economically harmed. At the same time, we also know that most people are quite altruistic about this, whether their families are ill or not. They really want to advance science. They want their friends and neighbors to get well. And so they are willing to donate. So how do we protect people and free the data? And I think that is kind of the essential early 21st century data problem we have. And it doesn't matter whether it's traditional health data in an EHR. It doesn't matter if it's the shopping data The example I like to give is you go to Target on Saturday morning at 8, you buy 3 bags of potato chips. They know you bought 3 bags of potato chips. They don't know if it's you or the soccer team. Pretty big difference in health impact from that. So how do we protect people from people perceiving missed signals, people using the signals badly, people having an unethical approach to the dignity of the people who are in that data? So I don't have the solution, but I can definitely tee up the conversation. And I will say the transparency is super helpful. So Eric talked this morning about the number of volunteers for all of us who decided not at the end of the day to share their EHRs. And people think it's a lot bigger number than it is, but it's really like 2%. It's a very small number. And that's actually consistent with what we found over a decade of polling people about their privacy preferences. Most people, whether they have very ill family members or they're busy moms and dads with young children, they just want the system to run. Right? And they want to be treated fairly, and they don't want to get creeped out about how you use their data and get some weird ad they didn't expect to have when they volunteered for research. And then there are some people who are just quite private, and we should respect that as well. So we have to kind of have a both-and conversation, how to be transparent with the people who are willing to volunteer about exactly what's going to happen with their data. And if that frightens them off, that's probably an okay thing. And I'll give you an example from Omada. Omada, we have a digital communications platform. We pair people in the platform, and we ask the participants to choose if they want their photograph or an avatar to be displayed. Do they want their name or a nickname? And they get to choose for themselves, knowing that when they're in this communications platform messaging the other DPP participants, they're going to be talking about their health with other people, just like we might have a conversation here or hydrating afterwards. So that's a very simple design feature that really empowers the people to control it themselves.
I want to talk about design for a minute. One of the
Bye, Eric.
Can I leave you with a question?
Yes.
Can I leave you with a radical question that changed my life as a patient, and I knew I had the right doctor. I walked into the primary care doctor, never having met before, and he said, "What shall we work on together this year?" That is the most radical question, and it just established a kind of role for me as a patient and a kind of citizenship, and then we lay out a goal of things we're going to work on each year. So I wanted to share it because it's just such a radical thing, and I think there's something in there that's worth
Thank you, Eric.
Bye, Eric.
It's those little flips, right? I mean, thinking about that same with Paul Wallace saying, like, sit back. What role do you want me to play, right? It's a pretty little flip, but it's pretty profound. After the healthcare.gov, I'll call it a disaster, things did not go well. We all know that.
Relaunch.
No. Well, yes. But after the relaunch, so Todd Park was my boss. He disappeared for several months. He came back with really long hair. And he came back with long hair because he actually had just relaunched that work over the course of 3 months. And one of the things that came out of that was a new a new branch of the White House called the U.S. Digital Service. And they hired a lot of technologists, and they hired a lot of product people, and they hired a lot of designers. And I think that recognition that one of the places where government often falls down is not respecting the experience of its constituents, of the people we're hoping to benefit, but just saying, like, it's good enough that we're providing you health insurance, and now you have to go through a really Byzantine kind of process. And we heard about that. Those are among those things that you said, those are, if you wanted the opposite of citizenship, you would make it complicated, you make it hard to understand. So I'd like to ask the group, what are some of the most profound flips they've seen in either design or approach, like Eric just pointed out, that have fundamentally shifted to a place of parity and citizenship? Like, what are some of the things you've seen, or just simplicity, like, that have really been profound?
I'll share, so this isn't my work at Smart Patients, this is a little bit of a side gig. I sit on the board of an amazing a nonprofit software company called Medic Mobile, and they build mobile tools for community health workers, mostly in Africa and Asia. And it is awesome, in any sense of the word, to see how a barely trained and barely literate person can become an unbelievably useful resource to her entire village as a result of having what is now a really cheap tool that both allows her to check on pregnant moms and triage pneumonia and diarrhea and have regular occasional connections with the nearest clinic. And the reason that works is not because the technology is that clever, although it is, and not because we now have infrastructure to allow almost any corner of the planet to have a near enough cell tower, but it's because this organization is ruthless about design. And it's taken a decade to get where they've gotten. It did not happen on the Silicon Valley pace, but it was, and it continues to be, just cycle after cycle of really simple, good quality, user-centered design.
I think one of the major shifts that I'm most excited about is companies' ability to move from assuming what patients want and need to actually asking, and recognizing we still have a long way to go to rigorously and systematically do that in a proactive way. But that general assumption has, I think, started to make incredible progress. So that we once assumed that if we had been in a therapeutic area for a long time, that we knew enough about what patients with a capital P wanted or needed, that we didn't need to ask. And I've seen fundamental changes in individual behavior, but also across companies that are stopping and asking patients at the right moment and are being further propelled when they get information that they didn't expect. And sometimes that information comes in the form of patients being willing to do more in a clinical trial than we would have assumed. A larger number of spinal taps or blood draws because they've been used to it their whole lives based on their condition. And they say, we want to help more patients, similar to your point earlier, Lucia. Like, we shouldn't assume that it is a hard and fast rule about what patients are willing to share.
So I think humility is going to be the killer app, and I would say spend most of my time working with clients, thinking through really, where is the market going, how can I collaborate with others, and how can I remain relevant? And if you kind of distill all those pieces down, the true innovators, the true kind of strategic thinkers are really being humble about their own positioning, knowing that to really have the type of impact that they're looking for, there is this need, desire, and frankly, mandate to work in a way that they haven't before.
Well, I have been in the sandwich generation, children and elderly parents, and for me, the killer app was caregiver access to the electronic health record. That's just that really simple thing of creating an additional credential so I can check my mom's labs. If I message her doctors, I say, it's me, they know it's me and not her. They can talk to her about what I've said. Like, it all works out. That's in our family, both of my mother, my husband's mother, Kaiser, it's great because it helps us help her continue to live the independent life she wants as an 80-year-old. Or in the case of a child, make sure your kid is getting all the things they need. And don't get me started on the camp forms, but that'll be.
Or a HIPAA when they go to college.
If I could say one more thing, e-signatures.
Oh, yeah.
Adobe
Which are underused in healthcare pretty dramatically, but certainly lawful. So if we could make our signature process for healthcare as easy as, how many of you guys have had a real estate closing in your house? How many have done it online? Okay, there you go.
Some of you may have heard or read about the Red Balloon Challenge that DARPA launched. And the challenge was, could you find the balloons around the world, right? And it was mainly an experiment in what works. And I think it was 9 hours the winning team took. And they did something really interesting. They incented each other. Like, they created a new kind of business model around, like, we're going to pay you for this much for a good lead. And essentially, the killer app was like novel ways of collaborating. And it's kind of shocking that it took only 9 hours to find these red balloons around the world. And I think one of my favorite people is Michael Sade in Cincinnati, who is also friends with Aaron Moore, who we talked about earlier, but at a recent event, he had a set of criteria for ground rules of kind of like how would you operate from a place of abundance and collaboration. And I thought they were really interesting. So I'm going to say them off and then ask the panel to kind of react and respond. So one was sufficient actors with capabilities to self-organize. And if you think about that's really interesting because it's not, I mean, we immediately think about patients, but actually researchers don't have that either, right? Second, a commons where people can share knowledge and data. So a common place that's not bound by a particular vendor, a particular organization. And ways for multi-actor teams to form. So this could be patient, provider, researcher, right? Mm-hmm. And I think we have all seen examples of these kinds of conditions being present, but we don't think enough. I actually think all of us, in many ways, is a very deliberate instruction of how you would create these things. But I'd love to hear people's reactions on the panel to this framework. So sufficient actors with capabilities to self-organize, common place where people can share knowledge and data, and ways for multi-actor teams to form. There's some examples where you've seen of that. Does that ring true as a framework for where we need to move?
Sounds a lot like a community.
Fancy words, right?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. And the other thing is probably not the direction you were necessarily heading, but I'll be brief. I also saw in what you just said the opposite of most any corporate structure, which is kind of similarly analogous, Lucia, to where you started, which is we design things to prevent bad things from happening. And oftentimes the way we organize ourselves is to prevent sharing, to keep confidential information in, to think about what our competitive secret advantage is going to be.
NDAs, right?
And I think that that's such a not a mentality of abundance, similar to a comment I heard recently about thinking about our on the balance sheet, thinking about our employees as assets and not liabilities, conceptually, perhaps literally. But these are very similar ideas.
I was struck, Claudia, by the idea of commons because humanities trained history student that I am, I think everything can be traced back to the tragedy of the commons. But in particular, what that made me think about is, and we talked about this a lot relative to setting up all of us, was this idea that as we think about people and data and even corporations, we have this kind of Eurocentric idea of individual autonomy, and that a community may have a different idea. And we might be able to get more if we took advantage of a different concept of community, whether it's from a different cultural background or different life experiences. But I think that if we think about commons, we can come back to that, but we have to intentionally fortify that approach, because otherwise we fall back into our, we have a for-profit economy and a Eurocentric culture, and we fall back into these habits of very individualized autonomy that, somebody said to me today, well, for Omada, what about, the health savings don't come for several years? I'm like, the health savings in our particular model happen right away, but that's a healthcare problem. You might invest in somebody's health right now or research right now, and you may not see the fruits on that person, on that investment, because it's for the overall population or the overall community. We need to fortify our communities.
Any other? Kathy, I'm wondering, one of the things we heard a lot from patient communities, disease groups early in the All of Us work was how do you tap into our energy, like that kind of, but it's tricky. It can be tricky.
It can be tricky, yeah. So there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of very motivated aggregates of patients who have made a big difference in, and Kathy Giusti's sort of a model here. There's many, many others, and probably many in this room, that have made a big difference in the recognition of a specific condition, about what matters to patients or caregivers who have that condition, and really playing an important role in the direction that research takes. But I can't help but think, and during this discussion, it just keeps on coming back to me that not everyone is positioned to be able to be a part of a community, to be a part of an assemblage. So elderly people who are alone, so loneliness is like the biggest issue. And then being overwhelmed. So the healthcare system is overwhelming and complicated and confusing. So the three things that you mentioned don't really address that issue. What about people with mental illness? It's hard to do aggregations and empowerment around that. So I think that while we have a ton of really powerful self-aggregating patient groups that have been listened to both in the healthcare system and in the research system, I still feel like there's some, and maybe Smarter Patients is solving this problem.
I'm wondering if that's something you try to solve for, or if that's an assumption we need to throw away, or both.
Yeah, it's funny, because I think most of the work that I do is fundamentally just about loneliness.
Really?
And I think health problems, just to generalize and in aggregate, just make us lonelier. And so it's a very convenient context, almost an excuse for building community. More recently, so most of our work is around providing infrastructure for peer support and mentorship for health systems who want to give their patients access to other patients in a way that they don't know how to manage themselves. And after doing this for a while, we're starting to have staff at health systems saying, how come there's no programs like that for us?
Yeah. So who is doing that, Roni? So there, did I hear you right? So a patient comes in and they're lonely and alone.
So
is it the provider that's saying, I'm going to help you
So
connect?
there's sort of a regular front door. For Smart Patients, it's free to join. It's pretty easy. We also work specifically with health systems for whom we build custom sign-up flows and add a couple of additional features. And the value to the health system is it's complex. But one of the superficial pieces of it is it's kind of like, so if I go back to the year 2000, that's when most of us clinicians thought we're so old school that we said, it'd be better if you just stayed off the internet. And that was like
Yeah, right.
that was like a real conversation. It was happening every day.
Okay.
I mean, now we literally laugh,
Right.
right? And so
well.
I think that same narrative is playing out right now, 15 years later. It'd be better if you didn't go to Facebook and try to find a bunch of other people with your same diagnosis.
bring in
You're
some
just going to get yourself into trouble. It's exactly the same conversation, just a little bit now, instead of individuals and static content, it's individuals and communities of people, all of whom have access to static content, right? So it's just more complex. And so we're having that same dynamic again, and before we didn't really solve it the first time, because we know, okay, great, Mayo Clinic has content out there, okay.
Makes it harder for the doctors to say no.
Sure, but so now we're having that same dynamic. Well, what is it? We have a well-managed version of that for health systems, but it's really an opportunity to talk about, it's interesting, well, why is this important to patients? And what about all the staff members who are burned out and have lost connection with the meaning that brought them to the practice of medicine in the first place? And how can we build these similar tools? Interesting, we have all these people connected now, and what problems can we all collaboratively solve now?
Yeah.
So, and it's also no accident that we do a bunch of work with Picori, because we have sort of built this infrastructure.
We need to chat.
Yeah,
We definitely need to chat. Can I make one more comment? So Eric, when he left, said that a profound thing that happened to him was his healthcare provider saying, "What are we going to work on together?" The single most memorable moment in all of my life's encounters with the healthcare system was when I was my father's caregiver, and we had found palliative care, and I was doing a briefing in the Senate, and my phone rang, and it was Austin, and I knew it was this palliative care guy that I was trying to reach. And after an hour and a half on the phone, kind of towards the end, he said, and so now I feel like I really understand your father's situation. How are you doing? No one had ever asked me, how are you doing? It was really profound. So I think it's sort of a cousin of Eric's, maybe they're related.
I've been working with my team on active listening, which I know sounds condescending, but it's actually super powerful. And
Is that why you go, mm-hmm?
we go back. We go back. I'll get her later. But one of the things I heard from somebody is that listening feels a lot like love.
Right.
It comes so close to the same experience that your reaction to it can be quite the same.
Yeah.
It's the connection that we're all yearning for.
It's the connection. I'm gonna throw out a story that many of you know, and I want to explore a little bit what is too far and what is not far enough. Our friend Dana has type 1 diabetes and built an artificial pancreas, a way for her to control her insulin more effectively by measuring her. But it's something she did with her husband, who's a software engineer. And her control is much, much better. She got a call from the FDA who said this is a little problematic because this is a type 1, this is a device, and she said, yeah, but I'm just using it for myself. And they said, okay, fine, but we're gonna keep an eye on this. And then they open sourced it for anyone to use. And it turns out that's not manufacturing, so don't fall under the FDA because it's open source and anyone can build it themselves, right? And a bunch of people are using it, open APS, like it's going great. So for those of us who are in the federal government, this is makes us a tiny bit nervous, right? And we had the same thing when we talked about return of results and CLIA labs, right? Where do we have to just draw the line and say, no, we have to regulate this and control something that might otherwise be, created from the bottoms up? Like, where should we be looking to control and regulate, even when it comes to things that are generated by patients or generated by community? And to what extent should we just say, you know what, guys, we're going to get so much more benefit from this that the attempts to control are going to squelch things that need to happen. So how do we draw that line? We've talked a lot about the CLIA. We've had a lot of conversations about this, but yeah.
It's funny you ask because we had that conversation this morning at my roundtable, talking about CLIA labs, non-CLIA labs, and actually the return of results in CLIA, which in fact only dates from 2013. Remember, before 2013, in most states, you could not walk into a lab, get tested, and ask them to send your results to you. And my predecessor, Joy, and Devin's predecessor at OCR worked really hard to change that rule just for certified labs. And the prior thinking had been the results needed to be intermediated by a professional because somebody might open their result. A, it could be a false positive. B, they could fall down and hit their head and cause an injury, and then litigation would ensue. Honestly, I had these conversations with people in the private sector. But you know what I hear in my work today, and what I heard consistently in the government was, I'm a grown-up. I get to manage everything else in my life as if I was a grown-up. I can go to war for you. I can drive a car. I can vote. Why can't I get this information about myself? And so that's sort of that we're in the warm-up. Like the key thing is don't patronize me. The grown-ups don't want to be patronized. And the nice thing about something like the CLIA rule is you have to ask for them to send it to you. It doesn't happen automatically. So if you don't want to know, if you want to wait and talk to your provider about it because you're in a team and your provider has said, I think we should work on this today. What do you think about that? Or what are we going to work on today? Oh, I have a lump in my breast. Then it's a dialogue, and that's exactly where the dialogue needs to happen, is with the individuals and their families and the people who are providing the professional care for them.
But Lucia, in that case, you're talking about information, and in your example, Claudia, it is actually an intervention.
It's the same. It's the same, and it's.
So convince me this is the same.
Well, so Are we being recorded? Like, how much should I swear? How much should I swear?
Yes, we are being recorded.
Excellent. So,
Claudia never swears.
so
Don't dare me.
I think there's a big concept and a small concept for me here. One is informed consent. And I'm using lowercase I, lowercase c. This is not someone who owns a process and there's a form. And but this is that that someone who's going to use that open source closed circuit pancreas that Dana and team have created must be presented with information that makes it clear what this is and what it isn't. So one is that so transparency is probably a better word, a less jargony word. Then the other is, what are the alternatives? Because this again goes back to, we're trying to prevent bad things from happening. What about the good things we want to happen? So what are the alternatives? If there were a excellent, well-functioning closed-loop pancreas system that Dana could use instead, then I think it would be a more reasonable discussion for us to say, we might make rules so that you aren't allowed to use your crappy one because you just feel like it, because there's a really good solution out there. But when the alternative is mediocrity, I think we have to be much more lenient about what we allow grown-ups to do with transparency.
Doesn't it also?
Oh, sorry. I think some of what we're talking about is it with the current internal system, and so sort of changes either big or small within the kind of health system. I think a lot of what we're going to see and continue to see is innovation and disruption by non-health organizations. Right. So we're talking about the health system, but I think the Googles, the Intels, the Apples of the world are empowering patients in a way. They are interacting and creating a user experience that's profound. And that is going to be critical, I think, in the way the patients kind of show up and, frankly, kind of demand to show up in a different way.
Well, and I wonder, too, if it begins with asking the fundamental question about what defines risk and benefit, and how do we co-create those definitions in specific therapeutic areas for specific instances, and not, again, assume that a certain level of efficacy or safety is required.
Kathy, are you convinced?
No. But here's why.
Yeah.
Because you had an assumption that people were going to be presented with fair and accurate information about the thing, right? So in the CLIA circumstance, there's at least some veneer of validity, analytic at least validity around the data that people are getting for themselves. But in this situation, let's say it wasn't Dana, but it was some charlatan. Do people have access to what that charlatan is manufacturing? And who is it that's responsible for making sure that the information that's provided? So it's sort of a cousin of the right to try situation, really.
Yeah.
So, a person I've worked with a lot, or an agency, is the Federal Trade Commission, who's not here. But they're besides competition, their stock and trade is protecting consumers, and every state has a consumer protection agency as well. And that's really the fundamental thing about what you're talking. If you put it in Roni's framework of, are we regulating to prevent bad things? That's a set of regulations at the philosophical level which say you can't lie to people and then sell it. You can't lie to people and make it available to the public. Now, around the edges, there's gaps. Nonprofits aren't regulated by the FTC, and we could have a whole session just on that. But the philosophy is you can't lie to people and in public and lure people into doing something under false pretenses or incomplete information, and that's the transparency. So we have a philosophy for that, but maybe we need to recalibrate how we apply it.
I'm going to open up. This is. I feel like we need to go to the bar after this and just continue the conversation. But for the floor, I think we have a mic runner. Yes, we do. Do folks have either, it doesn't have to be a question, it could be a comment, observation, something you want to share from the floor? We have one right back there. We can't even see you, so.
You could just
Howard.
talk loudly.
Or just talk, right?
Hi, Howard Look from Tidepool.
Oh.
I'm one of the people who used the open source instructions to build an artificial pancreas for my daughter. So this is a comment, which there is no doubt in my mind that open access to data, open access to information, letting patients and parents and citizen scientists be empowered is going to be one of the keys to moving the healthcare system forward. So any thought that we need to somehow close it down or regulate it or protect people from their own doing their own harm, I think is very misguided. I can tell you my daughter has been on what would be considered a Class 3 medical system for the last 2 years, and it has made her safer and healthier as it has with hundreds and hundreds of other people. So I think it should be a shining example of exactly what we should be doing.
To make a hypothetical counterpoint, so I am so much behind you, Howard. Hypothetical counterpoint, if there were emerging evidence that you or others were causing harm, especially in comparison to other alternatives, then we should be having a discussion about what, if anything, should be done to prevent you from causing such harm.
Yeah.
And
I do harm by
job is
eating
that?
donuts.
Yeah.
So
We're gonna come
publish
after
the
you,
data
Howard.
on the harm I'm doing.
Yeah.
but
There are
I
food
still
tracking
need
apps
to have
for that.
access to
Yeah.
that information
How-
in order to make decisions on my own.
I told you I would call on you, and I didn't need to because you called on yourself. But the thing I wanted to call on you for is actually a dialogue you had a year. When was that? I don't even remember. 2015 with President Obama about data. What was that conversation?
So the general question is who owns the data and what can be done with it. And
remember this conversation.
the conversation revolved around the fact that if I'm going to hook something to my body or my daughter's body, like it's literally pumping insulin into her. It's a potentially deadly drug, but it's also a life-saving drug. Don't you think that a person that has a machine attached to them that is affecting their body in that way should have access to data from that device? And shockingly, back at least in 2013 when we got started doing what we're doing, that wasn't a given. I think it's more and more a given now, but it's still really wicked hard to get your own data off of your own devices, and it's really wicked hard to get your own data out of your own health record. And so the conversation we had was, come on, folks, this is silly. There's no technological barrier, right? We know how to get data out of our Fitbits. We know how to get data out of our iPhones. We know how to get data through APIs. This isn't a hard technical problem. We just need companies and device makers and healthcare providers to make those APIs accessible so that people can start taking charge of their own health.
Thank you, Howard. I think we can. It's just gone. This is just gone. We
Zero.
did get gypped by about 5.
Can we have 3 more minutes?
How about one more question? Can we have one more question?
Okay. I was just going to mention that the Mike Milken interview is taking place at 3:15 in the ballroom, but we can do one more question.
One more question. Okay.
More of a comment.
Yeah, or comment.
We actually FDA just put out final guidance about that patients do have access
Yes.
to their device, to the records from their devices, and should indeed be getting
Thank
it.
you. Yeah.
Thank
So
you,
And,
just
FDA.
FYI.
and many of us tweeted love to Hugo Campos when that happened. Thank you all so much. This has been great, and we just hope we can continue this in other venues over the course of the day. Thank you.